The chairman of the board of Africa's Private Sector Summit, Professor Kingsley Moghalu, says some strategic errors in the policies of the federal government have impeded progress. He wants President Tinubu to rejig the federal cabinet before his first year in office. Arise correspondent Benga Ashiru reports.
Oil production.
You know, my spirit is telling me the last time he would drive a keke was yesterday.
The Leadership Conference and Awards in Abuja provided a platform for eminent Nigerians to take another critical look at the challenges and prospects of the Nigerian nation. They include scholars, opposition leaders, and government representatives. The keynote speaker is the chairman of the board of Africa's Private Sector Summit, Professor Kingsley Moghalu. The former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria fired the first salvo on the topic, Nigeria's economic distress. Which way, Nigeria?
The decisions to remove the petrol subsidy and forex subsidy were bold decisions and were correct. Given the country's revenue challenges in the crude oil production and export sector, Nigeria could no longer afford to subsidize the importation of refined petrol, at least fully.
His submissions generated reactions from both those in and out of government. While the forum provided an opportunity for frank conversation with several laudable recommendations, it was also a platform to honor several achievers. Amidst the prevailing economic challenges, President Bola Tinubu, represented by the Information Minister, was the recipient of the Presidential Award for Leadership Excellence. Benga Ashiru, Arise News.
Professor Kingsley Moghalu, Chairman, Africa Private Sector Summit, and former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, now joins us. Good morning, Professor Moghalu.
Good morning, Ruben.
Yes, well, I've had the opportunity of reading your presentation yesterday, the stressed economy, what is the way forward? You were quoting Garcia Marquez, Chronicles of a Death Foretold. But you say, well, the economy may be in crisis for reasons you identified, but that there is the possibility of resurrection. And so, you know, I took special interest in those solutions that you provided, 12 of them, I think. You know, if we could just start on the note of optimism, because the tone of your presentation was generally optimistic, that we can rescue this economy. But some of your solutions, you know, are quite interesting, like population control, like saying President Tinubu, before the first year in office, should reshuffle this cabinet. I'm interested in who and you think are, you know, maybe too incompetent to go out, to going about as Minister of the Federal Republic. Of course, there are other suggestions that you made. I think for, you know, that way forward, if you could take us through some of those critical solutions that you suggested.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ruben. I think you're right in noting that my presentation was generally optimistic, but it is not the kind of optimism you generally see in you know, government officials or political party supporters. It's optimism based, it's conditional on our doing the necessary and right things. And I said that if we do these things, we can recover, not just for this crisis, but to strengthen Nigeria's economy to actually become transformed. So I, you know, said that the real solution to our economic crisis is first and foremost to study what brought us here. And if we fix the problems, the habits, the incompetences, the lack of will that brought us to where we are, then we have fixed the crisis and we have actually prepared the way forward for Nigeria's economy so that we don't keep lurching from crisis to crisis, which is what we do. Every few years, Nigeria's economy goes into a tailspin. When are we going to actually become a prosperous nation? When are we going to become a true emerging market? When are we going to take, millions of people out of poverty? When are we going to increase the GDP per capita from the average of $2,000 since 1960 to $10,000, $15,000? So, and I said that, first of all, Nigeria can consider floating or issuing a 20 trillion naira bond to finance some projects in railways, in housing, in agriculture that will be nationwide across the 36 states, using land as a resource and as the backup for that issue, and creating 5 million jobs within 3 years. That's one possibility. Another possibility, which is not homegrown, but it's also valid, is that we can consider taking a $30 billion IMF stabilization program. And I argued that, even though the IMF may be a dirty word in Nigeria, but you're already doing most of the things they want. You're removing subsidies, people are suffering, there's anger, there's hunger in the land, and you're not getting any inflows that are significant because there is no confidence. Investor confidence has gone from Nigeria. And when investor sentiment disappears, it takes a lot of time and a lot of hard work to bring it back. And so I said, you might as well get the cash if you're taking all this pain. And I discussed the pros and the cons of taking an IMF facility. But for you to take an IMF facility, it must be a big fish. If it's not a big fish, you're wasting your time. If Nigeria takes anything less than $20 billion, ideally $30 billion, it will be like a drop in the bucket. So, but the advantage is that you get forex liquidity, you get support for your reserves, you get improved investor sentiment automatically. If you go into an IMF program, investors will return because they know that there is a factor that they trust that is now in play. And then third, there'll be a bit more transparency in our fiscal management because of the conditionalities that go with that. The cons are, of course, increasing indebtedness, debt sustainability concerns, challenges to sovereignty, and the fact that it doesn't solve the long-term problem. It's just a short-term measure. But you can take it while you're planning for long-term strategically and structurally, which is where we fall short. So I also talked about that I recommend the formation of a full-time economic advisory council for the president, made up of 7 economists. I was very specific, and I specified the disciplines in economics that those persons should be specialists in. And I talked about fiscal policy, industrial policy, trade policy, business economics, labor economics, agricultural economics, development economics, and political economy. It is the combination of these disciplines that form an economy. So when you're being advised by an economic advisory council, it should have the capacity internally to take a full spectrum approach to the economy. And such a council should address the question of how we structurally diversify our economy away from dependence on oil or agriculture or any one particular thing. And I also said that to restore confidence, President Tinubu needs to reshuffle his cabinet, because one of the reasons that investor confidence disappeared was when the process of appointing his cabinet, it was too slow. And then when he made the announcement, it was largely a very political type of cabinet, and investors were hoping for something more technocratic to deal with the crisis at hand. Everybody knew that he inherited a crisis, but like I also said, his government also made some mistakes that accentuated the crisis. There was an opportunity to begin to address that crisis, but the opportunity was lost by some of the actions or inactions of the present government as well. It took a long time to name a substantive CBN governor. It took even longer to form the Monetary Policy Committee, which is what investors are always watching, its decisions. So when you have a 7-month gap from an administration being sworn in to the first meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, it tells you something, let's just say.
All right. Population control, sale of assets. You talk about population control. Can anybody stop Nigerians from seeing procreation as the best form of recreation?
I like that, Ruben. That's a very nice turn of phrase. Procreation as a form of recreation. But that is very expensive recreation. You should only engage in recreation you can afford to pay for, or you can afford. So I believe that Nigeria has a very high poverty rate. And when we are bringing a lot more children into the world, in the current crisis in which we are, you don't have the resources to take care of those children. And we are projected that we'll be 400 million people by 2050. So who will be those 400 million people? Will it be 400 million people, 200 or 250 million of whom are young, able-bodied, uneducated, unskilled, poor people? That's a crisis. So, a large population is helpful to you if it's a productive population, such as we have in China. And even China had to control its population, because in Nigeria today, population is growing faster than GDP growth. And that's a disaster in the making. So that's what I said. We don't like to talk about population control because of cultural sensitivities, because of religious sensitivities. And that's why my suggestion was that population control should be voluntary. It shouldn't be forced on anybody. It has to be voluntary, done through education and providing incentives for people to limit the numbers of their families. This is what is done in Brazil, for example, for people to be able to access social security. There are incentives. So we want to be able to be a prosperous capitalist state, but also to have a strong social security system. But the problem with welfare and social security is that for you to redistribute wealth, you must first of all create wealth. We haven't created any wealth in Nigeria, and we're struggling with welfare. So this is the problem, because we don't think deeply in our country. It's almost as if thinking is anathema, and we like the flourish and the promise, but that is not the substance.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Moghalu. The question I'd like to ask you, which was the first thing you talked about in the critical fundamentals that we must consider to revive this economy, was the absence of nationhood. And that's quite important for me, because you cite countries like Singapore, like Taiwan, like Japan, and that sense of the feeling of nation building, and that is absent, as you said in your presentation, in Nigeria. What is the road to building that sense of nationhood? I ask this because we often talk about the absence or the silence of the National Orientation Agency, for instance, this divide along ethnic lines, and some simple things that we can begin to do to bring people together and to have that sense of nationhood. I'd like you to break down a bit further in terms of what must be done. What are some of the critical steps to be taken? Because you mentioned, and I quite agree with you, that it's critical if we're going to look at even economic progress in Nigeria.
Well, thank you for raising that question, because it is very fundamental. I actually gave the example of the United States as the most powerful economic country in the world, and even military, and how its prosperity was built on a worldview of exceptionalism, of freedom, of liberty, of, all kinds of things. And how its constitution played a very important role. America was founded by some very wise men who thought very deeply about what kind of, first of all, they had to decide whether it would be a monarchy and George Washington would be president or will be the king, or whether it would be a republic. And then, of course, George Washington became the first elected president. But if you go to the US Constitution, you will see very early that the Constitution gives very special pride of place to innovation, to intellectual property, the protection of intellectual property in the form of copyrights or inventions. You will see that it is already constitutionally provided for. And so, in Nigeria, what I will tell you, first of all, is that the speed of the leader is the speed of the gang. That's number one. So when you talk about the national agency and all those things, we have all those programs that can create, jingles and all those things, and that's very good, but it doesn't go very far. The reason it doesn't go very far is that our leaders do not show the example that the citizens can actually believe in. And that's why there's no faith in the government, very little trust in the government, because it's not, do as I say, but not as I do. It doesn't work. Nation building begins from the top. The people who lead, who have been entrusted to lead, must be seen to be not ethnic, not religious not religiously narrow. They must be seen to be inclusive. They must be seen to be visionary. You see? And it is that sense of having a vision that they must communicate to the people and show it by example in the way they appoint people around them, in the things they do, in the things they say, the company they keep. If you keep the company of Nobel laureates, people will have an aspiration to be like those people. If you keep the company of funny people, let me just use the phrase, well, you make funny people legit. You see? So this is what I'm talking about. And of course, we have to look at our constitution, because we don't have a proper federation in Nigeria. So when you're talking about building a sense of nationhood, you must first of all create a sense of fairness, a sense of equality, of opportunity, a sense of common destiny and shared purpose. The first place to begin is our constitution, because this country has several hundreds or thousands of ethnic nationalities, but you need to recognize that reality, and they need to see how they're represented and how their future is assured in the Nigeria project. Then you know you have a genuine Nigeria project. It's not to talk about it and be doing something else. No, that doesn't work. So when you say break it down, I'm breaking it down from the top. It must come from the top. It never is the business of the masses to put out a worldview for any country. The only possible place where that happened was in France with the revolution against the monarchy. Egalite, fraternity, all that. And so, but generally speaking, it is leaders who set the pace.
I mean, and I really get your analogy of France, of liberté, égalité, fraternité, that came after a lot of wars and Napoleon's ideology for what France should be, sort of like an even society. But I'd like to deep into your proposal. I'm good to see you again, Professor Moghalu. I'd like to deep into your 30 billion. You're saying 30 billion for the IMF. I have a lot of problems with the IMF. And you said we're already doing what IMF says we should do. But no, we're not. We're back to paying subsidies. IMF even said it in their report recently. So we're not doing anything IMF said. In fact, we've reneged on most of those policies. And that's why I say we don't even have policy. At first, there should be a clear policy, guideline that we don't even have. So the government doesn't even know what it wants to do as regards policy as we speak. I'm looking at this attendant inflation that will come with this, your Keynesian model. Because I get your school of thought. It's the New Deal. It's Roosevelt's 33 all over again, the New Deal. And I get the fact that you're a fiscal conservative. But the other part, a lot of fiscal conservatives don't look at, is the after effect on when you say, okay, there's a headline recovery. Where does the growth come from? You're still going to have challenges like inflation. You're still going to have challenges if the money is not properly appropriated in all parts of the economy. You're still going to have an expansion in an economy that's going to bring its own attendant effects. So you're saying apart from that, probably you say we should also put 20 trillion into rail lines. I get you want to target jobs because of your fiscal conservative nature. But the truth is, there is no Well, you said we should get it through bond. Probably if we look at another helicopter money like we've been doing all this while with Ways and Means, that's not going to cut it. Look at the attendant effect. I like the bullishness of Keynes and fiscal conservatism, but I also want to look at the very holistic method to it. I know you were shaking your head. Okay, probably you're going to go through bond, not helicopter money, not Ways and Means any longer. But let us look at the holistic effect. Will it bring us out of this?
Well, Rufai, thank you very much for those, probing questions. The devil is always in the details. But I was called and asked to provide a way forward. And I think I tried to discharge the responsibility that was given to me in terms of thinking outside the box. Now, we can go into each one of those proposals and flesh them out. For example, I'm not proposing helicopter money. I'm not proposing any continuation of Ways and Means. I support that it should be stopped. And I indeed say in my presentation that one of the major problems with Nigeria's economy is the failure of fiscal policy. Our fiscal policy needs to be completely and utterly revamped. It's so weak. It doesn't even exist. If you look at our budget every year, I said it, a lot of it is just a scam, unfortunately. I'm sorry to use the word, but the corruption in Nigeria's governance architecture is so endemic, is so structurally rooted, so that if you don't address it, and one of the ideas that I have, I think I mentioned it in the lecture, is that every budget we have must be subjected to a forensic audit by the president before it's presented to the National Assembly. Because civil servants in MDAs put in a lot of things. They bury a lot of dead bodies inside that document. So you see very outrageous repetitions.
Would you propose like an OBR in the UK, like an Office of Budget Responsibility, to do that job?
Of course. Yes, it would be a good idea. We can reform structurally so that we become more efficient and more effective. An Office of Management and Budget would be a very good idea, so long as it's manned by professionals, not by party hacks. That's the problem. The mixture of politics and governance has done Nigeria in. Because when you think politically, first of all, you're not thinking merit. You're not thinking competence. You're just thinking about a narrow interest. And that's why the job doesn't get done. So I was saying that we can look at that possibility of floating a 20 trillion naira bond backed up with land, and really like it's not a Marshall Plan, it's more of a Roosevelt New Deal, like you say. It's a bold possibility, and we can look at it in detail. Now, the IMF proposal or possibility is a very different kind of possibility. The asset sale possibility is a different kind of possibility. The problem we have in Nigeria, which we must address, is the inability to work on the basis of strategy. We are so ad hoc and short-term and knee-jerk. And that's why things don't happen the way they ought to. It's like I keep saying, it's not about the promise. It's not about the flourish. It's about the substance. It's not, there's a crisis, create another committee. No, we need to sit down and think about Nigeria 50 years from now, have a plan and have an execution plan. We have to develop the organizing principle. How do societies that succeed? And let's borrow some things and use some of our own local value systems to drive, real transformation. And we need knowledge. Nigeria's economy oftentimes is not run by people with deep knowledge. Knowledge matters. Knowledge matters. Let me give you an example. In Nigerian economic policy, there's always an emphasis on the macroeconomy. But like I have always said, every economy that is successful is run at 4 levels. There's the philosophical level, there's the institutional level, there's the macroeconomic level, and there's the human development level. The other 3 are completely ignored. And people focus on macroeconomy. Is it any wonder that we're always in a state of crisis? Then let me give you another example.
Professor Moghalu.
Many people do not understand.
Professor
Yes.
I will get you. We have read your paper. There are other issues I would like you to talk about.
Okay.
Now,
Please go
Among
ahead.
the solutions, you said the government should crack down on banks playing footsie. Crack down on banks playing footsie. Now, what exactly is the problem with the banks? And when you take all of these recommendations together, you are also saying in the paper that for us to be able to make progress may take up to 3-5 years. That this administration is saying this economy is not in distress, and that, in fact, by the end of this year, it will be, all of us will be jubilating. We should just be patient. But here in your paper, you are saying it will take 3-5 years. I hope by then we will still be alive. But maybe you start with the banks. Because these banks, they make a lot of profit. Yes. And we keep wondering, how are they making profit in this economy?
Yes, we have a situation in Nigeria where we have consistently, over the decades, deindustrialized Nigeria and financialized our economy. We have 200 million people, and we have a small set that have money that is sloshing around in the banking system. If you go to the banking system, less than 5% of Nigerians have more than 500,000 naira in their bank account, and that should tell you something. So the problem with the banks is that the banks are playing financial roulette, kalo. They're making money out of it because we're a resource extractive economy. But in the matter of Forex, there have been reports that some of the banks have been hoarding Forex. I think we had $7 billion in the banks, and there was a regulation put out by the central bank on the net open position. So it's very clear that there are many aspects of speculation that has driven the naira down. One is in the crypto market with Binance. Yes, we get it. But there is also the aspect of the banks. And we see the central bank focusing a lot on Binance and the crypto, but we don't see a push to bring banks under discipline. And I worry about that, because if you cannot discipline the banks, you cannot stabilize the financial system. And so I'm saying to the central bank, investigate the banks thoroughly. If you find that any one of them have infractions of the Forex guidelines and all those things, crack down hard. Fire a couple of CEOs, and everybody will sit up. We did it. We did it. So I'm not talking theory. We did it, and it worked. You know, somebody talked about Ikoyi economics and Fadeyi economics. I liked that article very much. It's a combination of the two. So raising monetary policy rates, I supported that by 400 basis points. Correct move, although belated. It should have happened before or at the same time as the naira was being floated or the rates were being merged. You know, otherwise you're devaluing the naira in a monetarily loose environment, and that's why the naira has dropped so much. So that's why I talk about knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, then you will be suboptimal in your performance. So the banks, we need to focus on the banks, and we need to crack down on the banks. They are part of the problem. Yes, no question about it.
So you said it will take 3-5 years before we get out of the crisis.
Yes. Let me talk about that. You see, you must make a differentiation between objective analysis and politically inspired, optimism, or what some people call hope. Just to crack a joke, there was a candidate that always used to say when he was campaigning, "I see hope." And then his opponents came out and said, "Don't mind that man. His wife's name is Hope." So he always sees hope. But the point, more seriously, the point is that it will take time for us to come out of this crisis. And anybody telling you that by the end of this year, Nigeria will be in a nirvana, it will be El Dorado, that person is gassing or just promoting some selfish or partisan interest and should not be taken seriously.
All right, I'd like you to just shed a bit more light, because you touch on one other topic that has been, let me use the word trending, but a topic of conversation recently, cut the cost of governance, especially because this administration has announced their move to implement the Orosaye report. Again, another administration has agreed to do this. And in your lecture, you talked about, as we've said here, the taste of the pudding being in the eating. But I want to ask you what your thoughts are on even the subnationals. You talk about we're not operating a true federalism and the role of the subnationals, because only recently, we've criticized the use of the bloated size of governance and the spending on buying cars for lawmakers. The Kebbi State governor recently announced that he had bought vehicles for the lawmakers in the state. And these cars, of course, most of them are not Nigerian made, because you alluded to that in your lecture yesterday as well. How do we begin to sell that sense and pride in buying Nigerian if the leaders themselves do not demonstrate by example, and then continue to have a bloated government in terms of the number of appointees in order to reward political friends and colleagues? How do we begin to channel that? Because we cannot talk about implementing the Orosaye report if even at government level, we haven't even begun to cut our own, cut the cost of governance or cut the size of our appointment. So I want you to focus not just on the federal level, but even the state governors, subnationals as well, and the role they play in this too.
Yeah, first of all, this will be the third time that the Orosaye report is going to be, quote unquote, implemented. We have newspaper headlines, Jonathan orders implementation of Orosaye report. We have newspaper headlines, Buhari orders implementation of Orosaye report. Now we have the current government, the president, ordering the implementation. And I said, let us hope that this will be the last time the Orosaye report will be, quote unquote, implemented for real and for good. Now, to move to your question, the masses of Nigeria are bearing the brunt of the austerity measures and the reforms. The politicians are not feeling it. Any reduction of the cost of governance that does not begin with the elected political class and high-level appointed political class is not real. Let me just use a very decent word. It's not real. So that's where we must begin. So when you go down to the subnationals, the governors, many of who are like emperors in their states, must also begin to make this cutting the cost of governance real. If you say you're cutting the cost of governance, but you have 500 or 1,000 special assistants, are you for real? No. But they do that as a way to reward their political supporters, and they will tell you that we have to create jobs for our supporters. But the man on the street has no job. So that's why restructuring or reconfiguring the federation is very important, because when you bring down responsibility and authority to the subnationals, you also increase the chances of accountability. When a governor is messing up, when a local government chairman is messing up, it's easier for the people to reach that person or to take steps than when the federal government is not doing the right thing. Abuja is too far from many people. So it will not be El Dorado when you reconfigure Nigeria. Nigerians will be Nigerians. Nigerian politicians will be Nigerian politicians. But over time, accountability will evolve because it is closer to the people. That's the point. So first and foremost, the Orosaye report implementation, yes, but the president and the governors must start with themselves. The 10 aircraft in the presidential fleet, I don't know how many there are now, must they all be there? If you sell 5 or 6, will the president not still move around? I'm sure he can, and he will, the National Assembly, we have to look at their perquisites. I think it's too much. And buying cars that are not made in Nigeria is the first sign of lack of loyalty to your own country, even though you're an elected official. If I were in the position of a governor or the president, I would not use as official vehicles any vehicle that is not manufactured in Nigeria. And we have several assembly vehicle plants now. Nord, you have it. You have Innocent, and maybe one or two others. You have Peugeot. So those are the things we should use because it sends a symbolic sense of nationalism. And you conserve foreign exchange when you do that, practically. That's why I condemned the purchase of vehicles for members of the National Assembly, imported jeeps. And very interestingly, you would have expected the opposition party or parties like the PDP or the Labour Party to have opposed this move. No, all of them joined in defending the purchase of the Land Cruisers, the imported Land Cruisers. That tells you something about Nigeria's politicians and the political class. And that's why I said yesterday very clearly, let it be very clear, I am not a politician.
I mean, and it speaks volumes about Nigerian politicians. And I mean, you've said a lot, but I would still want to probe, further. I think part of the, important ingredient to run an economy, like you talked about, development economics, economic philosophy and all of that. I think one that we should also add, apart from fiscal understanding, should also be understanding economic history and antecedents. And that's one thing we lack so much in this country.
Of course.
And we lack that. We don't, no institutional memory. It's probably gone and dead. Because institutional memory tells us in this country that wars were able to bring us out of economic quagmires. And even with the Western world, the New Deal you talked about, the New Deal did not bring the growth America needed. It was at the outbreak of the Second World War from 1939 to 1945 that brought about that growth. Tremendously, most of the growth too Hitler Germany recorded was because of the war. So we have also had the use of wars to reflate our economies, but we keep squandering them. Yom Kippur 73 gave us a lot of wealth, 32 billion in crude oil proceeds between 74 to 78, we squandered that. While we had economic quagmire in the 80s, the Gulf War gave us a respite. We set up this big thinking, physical side, DFRI and the likes, to be able to do a lot of infrastructure. We squandered the proceeds of Gulf War. Our currency balanced a bit because of the price of gold. We squandered it. The Russo-Ukrainian war that was supposed to help us, we squandered it. COVID-19, where we printed a lot of money to fill the fiscal side, by today we don't have those monies in those hospitals any longer. The healthcare sector is probably where it was even before COVID. Where are the ventilators? Where is the improvement? Where are the investment in the pharmaceuticals? My question again is, can we, cocksure believe that this Keynesian model will work for Nigeria? Because I'm at sea as regards what will work. My second question will be as regards the philosophical angle. What should even be the philosophical understanding of the Nigerian economy? Because we say we're a capitalist nation, but most of the inputs come from the government side. So it's a largely social-based economy. That's why you see VAT collection in Abuja is one of the highest, if not the highest, compared to Lagos in the country. So what kind of philosophy do we want to use to run our economy?
Yeah, thank you, Rufai. I think you've touched on a very important thing and something that is very dear to my heart. I propose that Nigeria should be what I call a strategic capitalist economy. And specifically, we need to be an entrepreneurial capitalist state. Why do I say this? When you understand economic philosophy, the first problem you must solve is the balance between the state and the market. We are getting it wrong. Like you said, a lot of the inputs are coming from the government, and that's why the market is distorted. The government should be the regulator. The government should frame the environment, the business environment with policy, but the government cannot be the market. A lot of times in Nigeria, the government is trying to be the market, and a lot of distortions happen. Smuggling and arbitrage and all kinds of things. So I believe that we should be an entrepreneurial capitalist state that will create the wealth that will enable us to be also a bit welfareist, because every serious country has a welfare system. Jesus Christ said, the poor will always be with us. There will always be poor people. And it is our responsibility to try to support them, not to give them every fancy they desire, but at least to make sure that they live above the poverty line. But we do that in a way that does not create a sense of entitlement. The only people who should have a sense of entitlement in our society are the old and the infirm. People who have retired from years of active work. We should not let them die in pain and agony. So there should be a social security system that takes care. In the report I shared at the event yesterday, prepared by the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, IGET, the think tank that I founded, we have a whole thing on poverty and how to end it in Nigeria. And that includes how to run an effective social security system. But it means that our fiscal management must become far more responsible. If half of the oil that you produce is being stolen, how can you run a proper social security? So corruption is a very important issue. How can we create transparencies? Every gallon, every barrel of oil that we produce in Nigeria should be accounted for publicly. There is technology that can show us that. And that's what we must fight to put in place, so that it's not just the NNPC telling us, well, this is how much we sold. That's not enough. We want to be able to cross-check the NNPC, and you can do that with technology. So somebody has to have the political will to put that in place. So when we talk about, you talk about, the Keynesian model and,
the need for economic history.
Friedman.
Understanding of economic history.
Like I said, for you to be welfareist, you must first create wealth in order to redistribute it. If you're not running an efficient economy where you can collect taxes that are fair and everybody who ought to pay is paying, then you cannot create wealth. If your oil that is giving you government revenues is not properly accounted for, you cannot create social security. So it's the balance. But the important thing is that Nigerians are very enterprising people. And that's why I say that Nigeria instinctively has to be a capitalist society. But we have to make it stakeholder capitalism, not just shareholder capitalism. That's my philosophical approach to the matter.
I'm sure.
How can we create wealth?
Professor
There are a lot of young
Moghalu,
people doing great things, but they're doing those things not because of the government, but in spite of the government. So we have a very inefficient and incompetent model of governance in Nigeria, and that must change.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kingsley Moghalu.